They mocked her injuries. But the general looked once and couldn't speak. Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she climbed down from the military transport truck. The desert heat in Afghanistan was brutal, even in the early morning hours. As a combat medic with the 82nd Airborne Division, she had been deployed for 8 months now, and every day brought new challenges that tested her skills and resolve. The forward operating base buzzed with activity as soldiers prepared for another dangerous patrol through the volatile Helmand province. Sarah checked her medical kit one final time, ensuring she had enough bandages, morphine, and trauma supplies. Her fellow soldiers often joked that she carried half the base hospital in her pack, but Sarah knew that in the field, those extra supplies could mean the difference between life and death. "Martinez, you ready for another fun day in paradise?" called out Sergeant Mike Johnson, her team leader. Despite the sarcasm in his voice, Sarah could see the genuine concern in his eyes. They had all seen too many good soldiers come back wounded or worse. "Always ready, Sergeant," Sarah replied, adjusting her helmet and checking her weapon. At 24 years old, she was one of the youngest medics in her unit, but her dedication and skill had earned her the respect of every soldier she served alongside. The convoy rolled out just after dawn, a line of armored vehicles making their way through the dusty streets of a small Afghan village. Their mission was to deliver medical supplies to a remote outpost and conduct a wellness check on the local population. It was supposed to be a routine operation, but Sarah had learned that nothing was ever truly routine in a war zone. The village appeared quiet as they approached. Children peered out from behind mud brick walls, their curious eyes following the American soldiers. Sarah always felt a pang of sadness when she saw these kids. They had known nothing but conflict their entire lives. Yet somehow they still managed to smile and wave at the passing convoy. "Stay alert, everyone," came the voice of Lieutenant Rodriguez through their radio headsets. "Intelligence reports suggest possible IED activity in this area." Sarah's grip tightened on her rifle. Improvised explosive devices were the silent killers of this war, hidden beneath roads and in abandoned buildings, waiting to claim unsuspecting victims. She had treated too many soldiers who had been torn apart by these deadly weapons. As they reached the center of the village, the convoy slowed to navigate around a disabled civilian vehicle. Sarah was scanning the surrounding buildings when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small child, no more than 6 years old, was playing directly in the path where the lead vehicle would pass. Worse yet, she could see the telltale signs of a buried explosive device just meters from where the child sat. Without hesitation, Sarah keyed her radio. "Contact front. IED spotted, civilian in danger." She was already moving before she finished speaking, jumping from her vehicle despite the shouts of protest from her teammates. The little girl looked up in confusion as Sarah sprinted toward her, the heavy medical pack bouncing on her back. Time seemed to slow as Sarah realized she might not reach the child in time. The lead vehicle was still approaching, and if it hit that IED while the little girl was nearby, the explosion would kill them both instantly. "Stop. Everyone stop!" Sarah screamed into her radio as she dove toward the child. She wrapped the little girl in her arms just as the world exploded around them. The blast was massive. The hidden IED contained more explosive material than anyone had anticipated. The concussion wave threw Sarah and the child nearly 20 feet through the air, slamming them into the side of a nearby building with tremendous force. Sarah's ears rang as dust and debris rained down around them. Her vision blurred, but her first instinct was to check on the child in her arms. The little girl was crying but appeared to be breathing and moving. Sarah had managed to shield her from the worst of the blast, but as Sarah tried to stand, she realized something was terribly wrong. Her left leg wouldn't respond properly, and she could feel warm liquid running down her face. When she touched her head, her hand came away covered in blood. "Medic. We need a medic." The irony wasn't lost on Sarah as her teammates called for medical assistance. She was the medic, but now she was the one who needed help. The explosion had damaged Sarah's inner ear, causing severe balance problems and partial hearing loss. Shrapnel had cut deep gashes across her face and scalp, and her left knee had been twisted at an unnatural angle during the impact with the building. But she was alive, and more importantly, so was the little girl she had saved. As her teammates rushed to help her, Sarah insisted they check on the child first. Through an interpreter, they learned that the little girl's name was Amira, and she was the daughter of the village elder. Sarah's quick thinking and selfless action had not only saved Amira's life, but had also prevented what could have been a devastating incident for both military and civilian casualties. The military medics who treated Sarah's injuries were amazed by what she had accomplished. Running toward an explosive device went against every survival instinct. But Sarah's commitment to protecting innocent life had overridden her concern for personal safety. "You're going home, Martinez," the base doctor told her after examining her injuries. "These wounds are going to take time to heal properly, and that balance problem needs to be evaluated by specialists back in the States." Sarah's heart sank. She didn't want to leave her team, especially not when there was still so much work to do, but she knew the doctor was right. Her injuries were serious enough that staying in a combat zone would put both herself and her teammates at risk. As she prepared for medical evacuation, Sarah's commanding officer visited her in the base hospital. "What you did out there today was incredibly brave," he said. "You saved that child's life, and probably prevented our entire convoy from being destroyed. I'm recommending you for a Bronze Star with Valor." Sarah felt embarrassed by the praise. In her mind, she had simply done what any soldier would do when faced with an innocent person in danger. She certainly didn't feel like a hero, especially now that she was being sent home while her friends continued to face danger every day. The flight back to the United States was long and painful. Sarah's injuries made it difficult to sleep, and the constant noise of the aircraft aggravated her damaged hearing. But worst of all was the knowledge that she was leaving behind the soldiers who had become like family to her. The Walter Reed Army Medical Center in Washington, D.C. was a stark contrast to the dusty forward operating base Sarah had called home for the past 8 months. Clean white walls, polished floors, and the steady hum of air conditioning replaced the constant threat of explosions and the harsh desert environment she had grown accustomed to. Sarah stared at her reflection in the hospital room mirror, hardly recognizing the person looking back at her. The left side of her face was covered in angry red scars from the shrapnel wounds, and her hair had been partially shaved to allow doctors to treat the cuts on her scalp. Her left eye had developed a slight droop due to nerve damage, and the hearing aid in her right ear served as a constant reminder of what the explosion had taken from her. The good news is that most of these facial scars will fade significantly over time. Dr. Patricia Williams, her plastic surgeon, explained during one of their consultations. "We can also perform additional procedures to minimize the more prominent ones. The hearing loss in your left ear is permanent, but the right ear should continue to improve with therapy." Sarah nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. The physical injuries were painful, but they weren't what kept her awake at night. It was the dreams that haunted her, visions of that little girl Amira playing in the dust just moments before the explosion. Sometimes in her dreams, Sarah wasn't fast enough, and she watched helplessly as the child was consumed by the blast. The nightmares were getting worse, not better. Sarah had mentioned them to the doctors, but they assured her that some psychological adjustment was normal after experiencing combat trauma. They prescribed sleeping pills and suggested she might benefit from talking to a counselor. But Sarah wasn't interested in discussing her feelings with a stranger. After 6 weeks of surgeries and physical therapy, Sarah was finally discharged from Walter Reed. She returned to her small apartment in Fayetteville, North Carolina, near Fort Bragg, where her unit was based. The familiar surroundings should have been comforting, but instead they felt foreign and empty. Her parents visited from Texas, and Sarah could see the shock in their eyes when they first saw her injuries. Her mother tried to hide her reaction, but Sarah caught her wiping away tears when she thought no one was looking. "Honey, you're going to be fine," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're the strongest person I know. These scars don't change who you are." But Sarah wasn't sure she believed that anymore. When she looked in the mirror, she didn't see the confident combat medic who had saved lives in Afghanistan. Instead, she saw a broken woman whose face bore the permanent marks of violence and war. The military had granted Sarah 30 days of convalescent leave to recover from her injuries. But as the days passed, she found herself becoming increasingly isolated. Friends from her unit would call or text, but Sarah rarely responded. She told herself she didn't want to burden them with her problems while they were still deployed, but the truth was more complicated than that. Sarah felt like she no longer belonged anywhere. She wasn't healthy enough to return to combat, but she wasn't ready to accept that her military career might be over. The Army doctors had been vague about her future, saying they needed to evaluate her ongoing recovery before making any decisions about her fitness for duty. The scars on her face made simple activities like grocery shopping feel like ordeals. Sarah became acutely aware of people staring at her, and she imagined that everyone was whispering about her appearance. She started wearing large sunglasses and baseball caps pulled low over her face, trying to hide the evidence of her injuries. One particularly difficult day, Sarah was standing in line at a local coffee shop when she overheard two young women talking behind her. "Oh my God, did you see her face?" one of them whispered, not quite quietly enough. "What do you think happened to her?" "I don't know, but it looks terrible," the other replied. "She should probably stay home if she's going to scare people like that." Sarah's cheeks burned with shame and anger. She wanted to turn around and tell them exactly how she had gotten those scars, how she had risked her life to save an innocent child while they were probably worried about their next manicure appointment. Instead, she quietly left the coffee shop without ordering anything. The incident at the coffee shop was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, Sarah encountered more stares, more whispered comments, and more people who seemed to view her scars as something frightening or disgusting, rather than honorable marks of service and sacrifice. At the grocery store, a small child pointed at her face and asked his mother loudly, "What's wrong with that lady?" The embarrassed mother quickly pulled her child away while shooting Sarah an apologetic look. But the damage was done. During a visit to the bank, Sarah noticed the teller's obvious discomfort as she processed Sarah's transaction. The woman barely made eye contact and seemed eager to finish their interaction as quickly as possible. Even worse were the people who stared openly, as if Sarah was some kind of carnival attraction. She began to time her errands for off-peak hours, hoping to encounter fewer people who might gawk at her appearance. The isolation took its toll on Sarah's mental health. She spent most days alone in her apartment, ordering groceries online and avoiding social situations whenever possible. The confident, outgoing woman who had thrived in high-stress military environments had been replaced by someone who felt anxious about simply walking to the mailbox. Sarah's medical appointments became her only regular contact with the outside world, but even those were sources of stress. She had to see multiple specialists, an audiologist for her hearing problems, a neurologist for her balance issues, an orthopedic surgeon for her knee injury, and a psychiatrist who insisted on discussing her adjustment challenges. "You're experiencing what we call hypervigilance and social anxiety," Dr. Jennifer Martinez, the psychiatrist, explained during one of their sessions. "These are common responses to combat trauma, especially when combined with visible injuries that affect how others perceive you." Sarah appreciated that the doctor was trying to help, but she didn't want to be defined by psychiatric terms and diagnoses. She had served her country with honor, saved lives, and sacrificed her health to protect an innocent child. Why was the focus now on her supposed mental health problems rather than her heroic actions? The most painful part of Sarah's recovery was the growing distance between herself and her military family. Her fellow soldiers were still deployed, facing daily dangers while she sat in her apartment feeling sorry for herself. She felt guilty for being safe at home while they continued to risk their lives. And she felt even guiltier for being miserable about her situation when she was lucky to be alive at all. The few times Sarah did speak with her teammates, the conversations were awkward and strained. They meant well, but their attempts to cheer her up or normalize her experience only served to highlight how much she had changed. They were still the same dedicated soldiers they had always been, while Sarah felt like a completely different person trapped in a damaged body. 3 months after returning from Afghanistan, Sarah received the phone call she had been dreading. Her commanding officer informed her that she was being assigned to a medical evaluation board to determine her fitness for continued military service. The board would review her medical records and current condition to decide whether she could return to active duty or if she would be medically retired from the Army. The news hit Sarah harder than any physical injury she had sustained. The military had been her life for 6 years, and she had planned to make it her career. The possibility of being forced out due to her injuries felt like losing her identity entirely. "Don't worry too much about it," her former squad leader, Sergeant Johnson, told her during a phone call from Afghanistan. "You're tough as nails, Martinez. These medical boards see soldiers come back from worse injuries than yours all the time." But Sarah knew her situation was more complicated than Johnson realized. It wasn't just the physical injuries that were the problem. It was everything that had changed about her since the explosion. She rarely left her apartment, had trouble sleeping, and jumped at sudden noises. The confident medic who had once thrived under pressure now felt anxious about simple daily tasks. The medical evaluation board was scheduled for early December, giving Sarah several weeks to prepare. She threw herself into physical therapy with renewed determination, hoping to demonstrate that she was capable of returning to active duty. Her knee had healed reasonably well, though it still ached in cold weather. The balance problems from her inner ear damage had improved somewhat, but sudden movement still made her dizzy. During this time, Sarah also tried to force herself back into social situations, hoping to overcome the anxiety that had developed around her facial scars. She started small, taking walks around her neighborhood, visiting the base commissary during busy hours, and even attending a support group for wounded veterans that Dr. Martinez had recommended. The support group met weekly at a community center near Fort Bragg. Sarah was nervous about attending her first meeting, but she was surprised to find herself among other service members who understood her experiences in ways that civilian doctors and counselors never could. There was Marcus, a former Marine who had lost his right arm to an IED explosion in Iraq. Jennifer, an Army sergeant who had suffered severe burns over 40% of her body when her convoy was attacked. Tony, a Navy corpsman who walked with a pronounced limp due to spinal injuries from a helicopter crash. But what struck Sarah most about the group wasn't their injuries. It was how they carried themselves. Despite their physical challenges, they moved through the world with confidence and purpose. They talked openly about their struggles, but they also laughed and joked and made plans for the future. The hardest part isn't the physical stuff, Marcus explained during one session. It's dealing with how other people react to you. Some folks look at us like we're broken, but we know the truth. We're warriors who paid a price for our service. Sarah found herself opening up in ways she hadn't since returning home. She talked about the nightmares, the anxiety about going out in public, and the crushing fear that her military career was over. The group listened without judgment and offered practical advice based on their own experiences. Jennifer shared her struggles with dating after her injuries. "I thought no one would ever want to be with someone who looked like me," she admitted. "But then I realized that anyone who couldn't see past these scars wasn't worth my time anyway. I'm the same person I always was, maybe even stronger now." Tony talked about his decision to leave the military after his injury. "At first I felt like I was giving up or letting my team down. But then I found a new way to serve. I became a teacher. Now I'm helping shape the next generation, and that feels just as important as anything I did in uniform." The group meetings became the highlight of Sarah's week. For the first time since her injury, she felt like she was part of something larger than her own problems. She began to see her scars not as disfigurement, but as visible proof of her courage and sacrifice. As the date for her medical evaluation board approached, Sarah felt more prepared than she had in months. She had been working with a physical therapist to address her balance issues, and the exercises had helped significantly. Her hearing had plateaued. She would always have partial hearing loss in her left ear, but she had learned to adapt to the limitation. More importantly, Sarah had begun to reclaim her sense of self-worth. The support group had helped her understand that her value as a person and as a soldier wasn't diminished by her injuries. If anything, surviving that explosion and saving Amira's life had proven her dedication and bravery beyond any doubt. 2 weeks before her evaluation board, Sarah decided to do something she had been avoiding since returning home. She visited her old unit's headquarters at Fort Bragg. Many of her former colleagues were still deployed, but some of the administrative staff and officers remembered her. The reception was not what she expected. Instead of the warm welcome she had hoped for, Sarah encountered a mixture of pity and discomfort from the people she met. They thanked her for her service and asked polite questions about her recovery, but she could see the awkwardness in their eyes when they looked at her scars. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who had served as her executive officer in Afghanistan, was particularly difficult to talk to. She kept her eyes focused on a point just over Sarah's shoulder rather than making direct eye contact. "It's good to see you getting better, Martinez," Captain Rodriguez said, her voice artificially cheerful. "We're all pulling for you to make a full recovery." Sarah wanted to scream that she had made a full recovery, at least as full as anyone could expect given the circumstances. She was the same skilled medic she had always been, just with some physical limitations and visible scars. But she could see that Captain Rodriguez had already written her off as damaged goods. The visit to her old unit headquarters was a wake-up call for Sarah. She realized that even within the military, there were people who saw her injuries as weakness, rather than evidence of her strength and sacrifice. It made her angry, but it also motivated her to prove them wrong. Sarah spent the final weeks before her evaluation board, documenting every aspect of her recovery and capabilities. She compiled letters from her doctors, physical therapy progress reports, and statements from members of her support group who could attest to her mental resilience. She also reached out to some of the Afghan interpreters who had worked with her unit and were now living as refugees in the United States. Through them, she was able to get an update on Amira, the little girl whose life she had saved. Amira was healthy and attending school, and her family remained grateful for Sarah's heroic actions. The night before her evaluation board, Sarah stood in front of her bathroom mirror examining her reflection. The scars on her face had faded somewhat, but they were still clearly visible. Her hearing aid was a permanent fixture and she would always have some balance issues. But as she looked at herself, Sarah realized something had fundamentally changed in how she viewed these marks. They were no longer sources of shame or self-consciousness. They were proof of her courage, her commitment to protecting innocent life, and her willingness to sacrifice for others. She thought about Amira playing safely in her village, alive because Sarah had been brave enough to run toward danger instead of away from it. Whatever happened at the evaluation board tomorrow, that little girl was growing up healthy and happy because of Sarah's actions. That was worth every scar, every sleepless night, and every challenge she had faced since that day in Afghanistan. The medical evaluation board convened on a cold December morning in a sterile conference room at Fort Bragg. Sarah sat at a small table facing a panel of 3 officers and 2 medical professionals. Her service record and medical files spread out before them like evidence in a trial. Colonel James Harrison, the board president, reviewed Sarah's case with clinical detachment. He read from her medical reports, listing her injuries and ongoing limitations as if she weren't sitting right in front of him. Sarah forced herself to maintain military bearing, sitting straight and keeping her expression neutral despite the humiliation of having her physical and mental state dissected by strangers. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Harrison began, "while we commend your heroic actions in Afghanistan, we must determine whether your current medical condition allows you to continue serving effectively in the United States Army." The board spent the next 2 hours reviewing every aspect of Sarah's injuries and recovery. They discussed her hearing loss, her balance issues, the scarring on her face, and the psychological evaluations that Dr. Martinez had conducted. Each limitation was analyzed not for how well Sarah had adapted to it, but for how it might impact her ability to perform military duties. Major Patricia Foster, the board's medical officer, asked detailed questions about Sarah's current capabilities. "Can you carry a full combat load over rough terrain? How do your balance problems affect your ability to operate in low-light conditions? Have you experienced any episodes of panic or anxiety that might compromise your judgment in high-stress situations?" Sarah answered each question honestly and thoroughly. Yes, she could carry a combat load, though she might move more slowly than before her injury. Her balance problems were manageable except in extreme conditions. She had experienced anxiety, but she had been working with professionals to develop coping strategies, and her judgment remained sound. But as the questioning continued, Sarah could see the doubt in the board members' eyes. They weren't evaluating her as a decorated combat veteran who had proven her courage under fire. They were seeing her as a liability, a soldier whose injuries might put others at risk. The most difficult part of the evaluation came when Colonel Harrison asked Sarah to demonstrate her physical capabilities. She had to perform a series of balance tests, hearing assessments, and basic military movements. Each test was designed to highlight her limitations rather than showcase her remaining strengths. When asked to march with a weighted pack, Sarah's scarred face showed the strain as she compensated for her balance issues. During the hearing test, her partial deafness was painfully obvious. The board members took notes, documenting every struggle and limitation they observed. "Sergeant Martinez," Colonel Harrison said as the evaluation concluded, "will deliberate and provide you with our decision within 7 days. You're dismissed." Sarah saluted and left the conference room, but she already knew what the outcome would be. She had seen the looks of pity and concern on the board members' faces. They had made their decision before she even walked into the room. Her injuries made her unfit for continued military service. The week that followed was the longest of Sarah's life. She tried to stay busy with physical therapy appointments and support group meetings, but her mind kept returning to that sterile conference room and the clinical way the board had cataloged her limitations. Marcus from the support group tried to keep her spirits up. "Whatever they decide, it doesn't change what you did over there," he reminded her. "You saved a kid's life and got blown up doing it. That makes you a hero in my book, regardless of what some board says about your fitness for duty." But Sarah felt like her identity as a soldier was slipping away. The Army had been more than just her job. It had been her purpose, her family, her entire world. The thought of being forced out because of injuries she had sustained while serving her country felt like the ultimate betrayal. The call came on a Friday afternoon. Colonel Harrison's aide instructed Sarah to report to the board's administrative office to receive their decision. Sarah's hands shook as she put on her dress uniform, knowing it might be one of the last times she wore it as an active duty soldier. The administrative office was small and cramped, with fluorescent lights that highlighted every scar on Sarah's face. Colonel Harrison was waiting with a thick folder containing the board's findings and recommendations. "Sergeant Martinez," he began formally, "after careful consideration of your medical records and current capabilities, this board has determined that you are unfit for continued military service due to the extent of your injuries and their impact on your ability to perform essential military functions." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had expected this outcome, but hearing it made official felt devastating. 6 years of dedicated service, a Bronze Star with valor, and a heroic act that had saved an innocent life. None of it was enough to outweigh the scars on her face and the ringing in her ears. "However," Colonel Harrison continued, "the board recommends that you be retired with full disability benefits at a 70% rating. This reflects both the severity of your service-connected injuries and your honorable record of service." Sarah nodded mechanically, struggling to process the information. She was being medically retired at age 24. Her military career ended by an act of heroism that should have been celebrated rather than treated as a disqualifying injury. The retirement process would take several months to complete, during which Sarah would remain on limited duty status. She would undergo final medical evaluations, complete administrative requirements, and prepare for the transition to civilian life. As she left the administrative office, Sarah felt completely lost. She had no idea what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. The Army had been her plan, her career, her future. Now she was facing an uncertain civilian world that had already shown its discomfort with her scars and her story. The hardest part was calling her parents to share the news. Her father was furious about the board's decision, ranting about how the military was abandoning a decorated veteran. Her mother cried, not out of disappointment but out of concern for Sarah's emotional well-being. "Honey, maybe this is a blessing in disguise," her mother suggested gently. "You've served your country with honor. Now you can focus on healing and finding a new direction for your life." But Sarah didn't want a new direction. She wanted her old life back. The life where she was a confident, capable soldier who saved lives and served with distinction. The life where her scars were badges of honor rather than sources of shame and social awkwardness. Over the following weeks, Sarah struggled with feelings of anger and abandonment. She had given everything to the Army, including her health and her appearance, and they were casting her aside like damaged equipment. The 70% disability rating felt like a consolation prize, a way for the military to ease its conscience about discarding a wounded warrior. The support group helped Sarah process these feelings, but it was a slow and painful journey. Jennifer shared her own experience with military retirement due to her burn injuries, describing the grief she had felt at losing her identity as a soldier. "It's like mourning a death," Jennifer explained. "You're grieving the person you used to be and the future you had planned, but eventually you realize that you're not dead. You're just different, and different doesn't mean less valuable." Tony talked about the opportunities that had opened up for him after leaving the military. "I thought my life was over when they retired me, but becoming a teacher has been incredibly rewarding. I'm still serving, just in a different way." Sarah listened to their stories and tried to feel hopeful about her future. But she couldn't shake the sense that she was being forced into retirement, not because of her actual capabilities, but because of how her injuries made other people uncomfortable. Her scars told a story of heroism and sacrifice, but too many people only saw them as disfigurement. 6 months after receiving her retirement orders, Sarah found herself working as a pharmacy technician at a civilian hospital in North Carolina. The job was mundane compared to her combat medic duties, but it allowed her to use some of her medical training while she figured out her next steps. Her colleagues at the hospital were polite but distant. Sarah could sense their curiosity about her scars, but most were too professional to ask directly. The few who did inquire about her injuries usually seemed uncomfortable when she explained that she was a wounded veteran. They would nod sympathetically and quickly change the subject, as if her military service was an embarrassing topic to be avoided. The work itself was routine and unfulfilling. Sarah spent her days counting pills, processing insurance forms, and dealing with frustrated patients who were angry about prescription costs or medication delays. It was a far cry from the life-and-death decisions she had made as a combat medic, and she often felt like she was wasting her skills and experience. During her lunch breaks, Sarah would sit alone in the hospital cafeteria, watching the doctors and nurses rush between emergencies. She envied their sense of purpose and the respect they commanded from patients and colleagues. These medical professionals were making real differences in people's lives, while Sarah felt relegated to the margins of healthcare. One afternoon, a young patient was brought into the emergency department after a serious car accident. Sarah watched through the pharmacy window as the trauma team worked frantically to save the teenager's life. The organized chaos reminded her of her days treating wounded soldiers in Afghanistan, and she felt a familiar urge to jump in and help. But she wasn't part of that team anymore. She was just a pharmacy technician whose job was to dispense medications, not save lives. The realization hit her hard. Her days of making a meaningful difference were apparently over, ended by an explosion that had left her scarred and supposedly unfit for important work. That evening, Sarah attended her support group meeting feeling more depressed than she had in weeks. The other members noticed her mood immediately and encouraged her to talk about what was bothering her. "I feel like I'm invisible," Sarah admitted. "At the hospital, I'm just the girl with the scarred face who counts pills. Nobody sees me as someone who saved lives or served her country with honor. I'm nobody special anymore." Marcus shook his head firmly. "You're still the same person who ran toward an explosion to save a child. That doesn't change because you're working a different job now." Jennifer added her perspective. "The problem isn't that you're not special anymore. It's that you're working in the wrong place. You need to find somewhere that values your experience and your story." Over the following weeks, Jennifer's words stuck with Sarah. She began researching organizations that worked with veterans and military families, looking for opportunities that might make better use of her background and experiences. She discovered a nonprofit organization called Operation Healing that provided support services to wounded veterans and their families. They offered counseling, job training, advocacy, and peer support programs designed specifically for service members dealing with combat-related injuries. Sarah was intrigued by their peer counselor program, which trained wounded veterans to provide support and guidance to recently injured service members. The program required participants to share their own stories of injury and recovery as a way of helping others navigate similar challenges. The thought of talking openly about her injuries and experiences was terrifying, but it also felt like a potential path back to meaningful work. Sarah had always been good at helping others, and her own journey through trauma and recovery had given her insights that might benefit other wounded warriors. She applied for the peer counselor training program and was accepted within 2 weeks. The program director, a former Army colonel who had lost both legs in Iraq, explained that Sarah's combination of medical training and personal experience with combat injuries made her an ideal candidate. The training was intensive and emotionally challenging. Sarah had to relive her own trauma while learning how to help others process theirs. She practiced telling her story in front of other veteran peer counselors, gradually becoming more comfortable with discussing the explosion, her injuries, and her struggles with recovery. But the most transformative part of the training came when Sarah was paired with her first client, a young Marine named David, who had been severely injured by a roadside bomb in Syria. David had lost his right eye and suffered extensive facial scarring, and he was struggling with depression and social anxiety. When Sarah first met David, she could see her own pain reflected in his eyes. He was angry about his injuries, bitter about being medically retired, and convinced that his life was essentially over at age 22. He barely looked at Sarah during their first session, staring at the floor and giving one-word answers to her questions. "I know this is hard," Sarah told him gently. "I've been where you are right now." David looked up for the first time, taking in Sarah's facial scars and hearing aid. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly. Sarah told him about Afghanistan, about Amira, about the explosion and her long recovery process. She talked about the stares and whispers, the medical evaluation board, and the struggle to find purpose after being medically retired. David listened intently, and for the first time since his injury, he began to open up about his own experiences. Over the following months, Sarah worked with David and several other wounded veterans. Each client presented unique challenges, but Sarah found that her own story of injury and recovery resonated with them in ways that traditional counselors couldn't match. She understood the shame they felt about their scars, the anger about their forced retirement from military service, and the sense of isolation that came from feeling different from the rest of civilian society. More importantly, she could show them that it was possible to build a meaningful life after devastating injuries. Sarah's work with Operation Healing began to attract attention within the veteran community. Her clients made remarkable progress, and word spread about the scarred medic who was helping other wounded warriors find hope and purpose again. The organization asked her to speak at conferences and training events, sharing her expertise with other peer counselors and mental health professionals. At first, speaking in front of large groups was intimidating. Sarah worried that people would focus on her appearance rather than her message, but she discovered that her scars actually enhanced her credibility. They were visible proof that she understood the challenges her audience faced. During one particularly memorable speaking engagement at a veterans hospital, Sarah addressed a room full of recently wounded service members and their families. She told her story with honesty and emotion, describing both the darkest moments of her recovery and the gradual process of rebuilding her life with purpose. "Your injuries don't define your worth," she told them. "They're part of your story, but they're not the end of your story. You still have so much to offer the world, even if it looks different than what you originally planned." After her presentation, a young soldier's wife approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "My husband lost his arm last month, and he's been saying his life is over. But hearing you speak gives me hope that we can get through this." These moments of connection and impact reminded Sarah why she had become a medic in the first place, to help people heal and find strength in their darkest moments. Her role had evolved from treating physical wounds to helping heal emotional and psychological trauma, but the core mission remained the same. Sarah also began volunteering with local schools, speaking to students about military service, sacrifice, and resilience. She was surprised to find that young people responded positively to her story and her appearance. Rather than being frightened or put off by her scars, they were curious and respectful. During one school visit, a teenage girl raised her hand and asked, "Do you ever regret saving that little girl since it caused all your injuries?" Sarah smiled, thinking of Amira growing up safely in Afghanistan. "Never, not for a single second. Some things are more important than our own comfort or safety. That little girl is alive because I was willing to take risks to protect her. That will always be worth it." The question sparked a meaningful discussion about courage, service, and the importance of standing up for others, even when it's difficult or dangerous. Sarah realized that her scars weren't just marks of injury. They were teaching tools that helped her connect with people and share important lessons about heroism and sacrifice. As her reputation grew within the veteran community, Sarah was invited to participate in a documentary about wounded warriors and their recovery journeys. The filmmaker wanted to showcase different examples of how service members had rebuilt their lives after combat injuries. Sarah was hesitant about participating in the documentary. The thought of having her story broadcast to a national audience was both exciting and terrifying. She worried about the potential for negative reactions or exploitation of her experiences. But the filmmaker, a veteran himself, assured Sarah that the documentary would be respectful and focused on celebrating the resilience of wounded warriors rather than exploiting their trauma. After discussions with her support group and mentors at Operation Healing, Sarah agreed to participate. The documentary process was intensive, involving multiple interviews, behind-the-scenes footage of her work with clients, and visits to significant locations from her story. Sarah found herself returning to Walter Reed Army Medical Center for the first time since her initial treatment, reflecting on how much her perspective had changed since those dark early days of recovery. Standing in the same hospital room where she had first seen her scarred face in the mirror, Sarah realized how far she had traveled emotionally and professionally. The woman who had once hidden behind sunglasses and baseball caps was now confident enough to share her story with the world. The documentary also included footage of Sarah speaking at the Veterans Hospital and working with her clients at Operation Healing. Viewers would see her not as a victim of war, but as a powerful advocate and healer who had transformed her own trauma into a tool for helping others. During the final interview for the documentary, the filmmaker asked Sarah what she wanted people to understand about wounded veterans and their experiences. "I want people to see us as whole human beings," Sarah replied. "Yes, we have scars and limitations, but we also have incredible strength, wisdom, and contributions to make. Our injuries are proof of our willingness to sacrifice for others, not evidence that we're broken or less valuable than anyone else." The documentary was scheduled to premiere at a major film festival, with potential for nationwide distribution afterward. Sarah felt nervous but proud about sharing her story on such a large platform. She hoped that her experiences might help change public perceptions about wounded veterans and inspire other injured service members to pursue their own paths to healing and purpose. The film festival premiere was held at a prestigious venue in Los Angeles, with red carpets, media coverage, and an audience filled with celebrities, military officials, and veteran advocates. Sarah felt overwhelmed as she stepped out of the car, wearing an elegant black dress that she had chosen specifically because it didn't hide her scars. For the first time since her injury, Sarah made no attempt to conceal the marks on her face. Her hair was styled away from her face, her hearing aid was visible, and the scars that had once caused her so much shame were now displayed with quiet pride. She had learned that hiding her injuries sent the wrong message, both to herself and to others who might be struggling with similar challenges. The documentary, titled Unbroken Warriors, premiered to a standing ovation. Sarah watched herself on the big screen, reliving her journey from the explosion in Afghanistan to her current work helping other veterans heal. The film captured both her vulnerabilities and her strengths, showing her as a complex human being rather than a simple victim or hero. During the question and answer session after the screening, an audience member asked Sarah how she had found the courage to share such a personal story so publicly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear," Sarah replied, her voice steady and clear. "It's doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. I was terrified to put my story out there, but I realized that staying silent wasn't helping anyone. If sharing my experiences can help even one person feel less alone or more hopeful, then it's worth the risk." A prominent studio executive approached Sarah after the screening, expressing interest in developing her story into a feature film. The attention was flattering, but Sarah was more interested in the veteran advocates and military families who thanked her for giving voice to their experiences. Within weeks of the premiere, Unbroken Warriors was picked up for national distribution. Sarah found herself thrust into a media spotlight she had never expected, appearing on news programs and talk shows to discuss veteran issues and the challenges faced by wounded warriors. The increased visibility brought both opportunities and challenges. Sarah received thousands of messages from veterans and their families, sharing their own stories and thanking her for her advocacy work. But she also encountered some negative reactions from people who questioned her motives or criticized her appearance. One particularly harsh online comment suggested that Sarah was exploiting her injuries for attention and money. The accusation stung because it struck at one of Sarah's deepest fears, that people might see her as seeking pity rather than trying to help others. Marcus from her support group helped put things in perspective. "People who write stuff like that don't understand what we've been through," he told her. "They're probably the same ones who thank us for our service but don't want to see the real cost of that service. You're not exploiting anything. You're educating people about the reality of war and recovery." The success of the documentary led to new opportunities for Sarah within the veteran advocacy community. She was invited to testify before Congress about the need for better support services for wounded warriors, particularly those dealing with visible injuries and the social challenges they created. Sitting in the congressional hearing room, Sarah felt the weight of representing thousands of wounded veterans who didn't have a voice in these important discussions. She spoke passionately about the gaps in mental health services, the challenges of transitioning to civilian careers, and the need for public education about the realities of combat injuries. When people see my scars, they often look away or stare inappropriately, Sarah testified. But these marks represent my willingness to put others before myself, to run toward danger when an innocent child was in harm's way. We need to change how society views wounded veterans, not as objects of pity, but as examples of courage and sacrifice. Several congressmen and women thanked Sarah for her service and her testimony, and she left feeling hopeful that her advocacy might lead to real policy changes that could help other wounded veterans. The most meaningful recognition came when Sarah received a call from the Department of Veterans Affairs. They wanted to hire her as a senior advisor for their Wounded Warrior Transition Program, helping to develop better support services for recently injured veterans. The position would allow Sarah to influence policy on a national level while continuing her direct work with wounded veterans. She would travel to VA hospitals across the country, training staff and developing programs based on her experiences as both a wounded veteran and a peer counselor. On her first day at the VA headquarters in Washington, D.C., Sarah walked through the same halls where her own disability case had been processed years earlier, but now she was returning as an advocate and leader, someone with the power to improve the system for future wounded warriors. Her office walls were decorated with photos from her deployment to Afghanistan, her work with Operation Healing, and letters from veterans she had helped over the years. But the most prominent display was a framed photo of Amira, the little girl whose life she had saved. The picture had been sent by Amira's family, showing her now as a healthy 8-year-old student wearing a school uniform and smiling brightly. 3 years after starting her work with the VA, Sarah received an unexpected visitor at her office. General Patricia Williams, a 3-star general who was touring VA facilities as part of a comprehensive review of veteran services, had requested a meeting with Sarah specifically. Sarah was nervous about meeting such a high-ranking officer, especially given her own experience with the military's medical evaluation process. She worried that the general might view her advocacy work as criticism of military leadership or procedures. General Williams entered Sarah's office with the bearing and confidence expected of her rank, but her expression was thoughtful rather than stern. She took a seat across from Sarah's desk and studied the displays on the walls, particularly lingering on the photo of Amira. "Sergeant Martinez," General Williams began, then paused and corrected herself. "I'm sorry, Ms. Martinez. I wanted to meet with you personally because your work has come to my attention through several channels. The Wounded Warrior Transition Program you've helped develop has become a model for military installations worldwide." Sarah felt a mixture of pride and wariness. "Thank you, General. I'm just trying to help other veterans navigate challenges that I experienced myself." General Williams nodded slowly, her eyes returning to Sarah's facial scars. For a moment, Sarah braced herself for the familiar look of discomfort or pity she had seen so many times before. But when the general spoke, her voice carried a tone of deep respect. "Ms. Martinez, I've read your service record and the circumstances of your injury. I've also reviewed the decision of your medical evaluation board." She paused, her expression growing serious. "I need to tell you something that I think you deserve to hear." Sarah felt her heart rate increase, uncertain about what the general was going to say. "What you did in Afghanistan, running toward that explosion to save a child, represents the very best of what we want our soldiers to be. The fact that you were medically retired because of injuries sustained during that heroic act has troubled me deeply." General Williams stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Washington, D.C. skyline before continuing. "I've spent considerable time reviewing cases like yours, and I've come to believe that our evaluation processes sometimes focus too heavily on limitations rather than capabilities. We're losing valuable soldiers who could continue to contribute in different roles." She turned back to face Sarah directly. "I can't change what happened to you, but I can learn from it. Your advocacy work has helped us understand that wounded veterans often have unique insights and abilities that we've been overlooking." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she maintained her composure. This was the acknowledgement she had never expected to receive. Validation from military leadership that her forced retirement had been a mistake, and that her continued service could have been valuable. More importantly, General Williams continued, your work since leaving the military has demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership and dedication we need more of. You've turned your own trauma into a tool for helping others, and you've become a powerful advocate for positive change. The general paused, then looked directly at Sarah's scars without flinching or looking away. These marks on your face aren't signs of damage, Ms. Martinez. They're badges of honor that tell a story of extraordinary courage. Anyone who can't see that is missing the point entirely. For the first time since her injury, Sarah felt truly seen and valued for who she was rather than judged for what she had lost. The general's words carried weight not just because of her rank, but because they represented a fundamental shift in how the military viewed wounded veterans. As General Williams prepared to leave, she shook Sarah's hand firmly. Keep doing what you're doing, Ms. Martinez. The work you're doing here is changing lives and changing minds. That little girl you saved would be proud to see what you've accomplished. After the general left, Sarah sat alone in her office reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She thought about the scared and angry young woman who had hidden behind sunglasses, convinced that her life was over because of some facial scars. That woman could never have imagined the impact and influence she would eventually achieve. Sarah picked up the photo of Amira and smiled. The explosion that had scarred her face and ended her military career had also set her on a path toward a different kind of service, one that was arguably more important than anything she could have accomplished as a combat medic. She was no longer just someone who saved lives in emergency situations. She had become someone who helped rebuild lives that had been shattered by trauma and loss. Her scars, which had once been sources of shame, had become powerful symbols of resilience and hope for thousands of wounded veterans and their families. The little girl playing in the dust in Afghanistan was now a healthy student with dreams for her future, and the young medic who had run toward an explosion to save her had become a national advocate whose own dreams had expanded far beyond anything she had originally imagined. Sarah's story had become proof that heroes aren't defined by their wounds, but by what they choose to do with them.